Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we're going to talk about the issue of Dungeons & Dragons Canon and Dungeons & Dragons Resonance. Alright, so Dungeons & Dragons Canon is something that's really, really fascinating. It's growing in importance, and it's growing in complexity. So, if you asked a month ago about Dungeons & Dragons Canon, 5th edition Canon, if you asked a month ago about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Canon, the answer was simple, right? And it was, what is canon in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is, and this came from Jeremy Crawford, he said, everything that's in a hardback Dungeons & Dragons Wizards of the Coast book is canon, okay? And that's a very interesting statement. So that means the MM, the PHB, the DMG, all the utility books, Xanathar and Tasha's, all the adventure books, Rime of the Frost Maiden, Storm King's Thunder, all of the setting books, Eberron, Exandria, Ravnica, Theros, so forth, right? All those hardback books were canon 5th edition. Pretty simple answer, right? Actually frustrated a lot of people, but it was simple, okay? James Wyatt rolls up with Fizbans, Treasury of Dragons, and drops a bomb, just drops this cultural design bomb in the middle of Dungeons & Dragons and says, hey, I am changing canon now, and basically Dungeons & Dragons is the material. So Dungeons & Dragons is its foundational structure is the material world, and we are establishing now the first world, right? And what happens with the first world is it explodes, right? And actually, not only was he dropping a figurative bomb, a figurative design bomb, and he was also dropping a figurative, dropping a quite literal lore bomb, right? And he's saying, okay, so the first world explodes, and it explodes into an almost infinite number of shards. And what are those shards? They're whatever you're running in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So your unusual game, your unique game, is simply a seed of the exploded, is a shard of the exploded first world. This is a huge statement. It's a massive change in canon, okay? And it says, Scott Garibay, your Omni Dungeon Master game, that where everybody's a player and everybody's a dungeon master, and you guys are playing in Faerun, that is a canon Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game. And then also, Mike, your 1989 Berlin spy game that is run with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is literally just a shard of the first world and is a canon Dungeons & Dragons game. That's an incredible statement. Canon then becomes much less useful, right? So canon is literally any game that is run, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition canon is any game run with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition PHB, DMG, Monster Manual, and using the page 4 rule of the DMG, where it says the rules are not in charge, you are in charge as the Dungeon Master. That makes every single outrageous, really far-ranging Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game, anything you do, as long as you are using the DMG, the PHB, and the Monster Manual, and then you're good. You're D&D 5th edition canon, right? So that gets really problematic because you're like, wait a second. If somebody's 1989 Berlin spy game is just as much canon as a game that was run in Faerun using fighter, cleric, wizard, rogue, what does canon even mean, right? And so canon becomes much less useful, right? Now, actually, I think it's really wonderful because it's very inviting and it's very inclusive to allow all these far-ranging games to be Dungeons & Dragons canon. But I think it means we now need to recognize resonance, okay? And I'm going to talk about the two types of Dungeons & Dragons resonance that in my humble opinion exist, right? So Dungeons & Dragons resonates, so because canon is so much less useful now to talk about games with, because it accepts literally anything run with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition rules, right? Then what you're dealing with is my game Dungeons & Dragons resonant, okay? And I believe that Dungeons and Dragons resonates on two frequencies, the dungeon frequency and the dragon frequency. All right, now what is the dungeon frequency and what is the dragon frequency? All right, so we get into this, right? We get into the issue of Dungeons and Dragons resonance. Well, let me explain dungeon resonance. Dungeon resonance is the lower frequency, okay, not the higher frequency. It's the lower frequency, and it resonates with the current now version of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So 5th edition is the current version of Dungeons and Dragons. 5th edition is the current version of Dungeons and Dragons, okay? So that is so anything that resonates with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is dungeon resonant. Okay, now let me explain. Let me give you an example. Okay, so right now, if you run a Faerun campaign that uses fighter, cleric, rogue, wizard, and it uses human, elf, dwarf, all of those classes, all of those races are fully established and fully detailed within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, right? But if you're running, so that game is dungeon resonant. It actually resonates with the current version of Dungeons & Dragons, which is Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, okay? So let's say that you are running so now let's talk about dragon resonance. Okay, does it resonate? Does it have dragon resonance? What is dragon resonance? Well, dragon resonance is anything that resonates with Gygax. Okay, so what version does Gygax resonate on? Well, Gygax resonates on every version. Every version of Dungeons and Dragons is a Gygax version. Okay, he established Dungeons and Dragons 1E. He left TSR before 2nd edition started, right? However, 2nd edition never occurs if Gygax is not there. Gygax is the creator. He creates Dungeons & Dragons. He therefore is every version of Dungeons & Dragons because nothing happens without him, right? Dungeons & Dragons 2E doesn't happen without Gygax. Dungeons & Dragons 3E doesn't happen without Gygax. Dungeons & Dragons 4E doesn't happen without Gygax, right? Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition doesn't happen without Gygax. Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition would not happen without Gygax, okay? Gygax is every version, right? So anything that you run that comes from 1E is Gygax. Anything you run that comes from 2E is Gygax. Anything that you run from 3E is Gygax. Anything you run from 4E is Gygax. Anything you run from 5th edition is Gygax, okay? Now, actually, and I should say, no, let's minus that, right? So, 5th edition is pulled out. What you're doing is resonant with the current version, that's a dungeon resonance. Every other version, okay, every past version, I should say, is Gygax. 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? So let me give you an example of this, right? So what is a Gygax resonant game, right? So you're running Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but you're running a Dark Sun game, okay? Now, Dark Sun does not exist in 5th edition. There's no setting book for Dark Sun, okay? However, you are allowed to run Dark Sun, right, by page 4 of the Dungeon Master Guide says, the rules aren't in charge, you are in charge. That gives you permission to run a Dark Sun 5th edition game, right? And so you're going to have to do some work, and you're going to have to bring in, you'll have to kit out like the races and the classes that are specific to Dark Sun, okay? So if you're using Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to run a Dark Sun game, that game is not resonant with 5th edition because Dark Sun isn't in 5th edition, but it is resonant with with Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition because that's where Dark Sun was established. Lorraine Williams brought Brom in, and Brom and a few other writers really created, very much created Dark Sun, right? So basically, if you run a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Dark Sun game, you are running a game that resonates with Gygax and is a dragon resonant game, right? So basically, when you're running a game, if it's resonating, if it's consistent to what's been established in the books of the current edition, that's a dungeon resonant game. If you're running a game that has elements from any edition before the current edition, that is a dragon resonant game, okay? And so Dungeons & Dragons, in my humble opinion, resonates on two frequencies. The dungeon frequency, which is the now version of Dungeons & Dragons, the lower resonance, okay? Or it resonates with the dragon resonance, which is the higher resonance, okay? And that is anything that is using elements from previous previous games, okay? And so that's where we land with with Dungeons & Dragons overall. And so you have these two resonances, right? Now, low and high, it's not a value issue, right? One is not more valuable than another, just like in, and the reason why we would say that is, basically in music, right? Higher notes are not more valuable than lower notes. They both have the same value, okay? And they're both needed, right? And so I think, now, again, I would be using Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to run elements from older versions, right? And I do think that Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition, Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, their true value is simply owning them, reading them, experiencing them in every way but play, so that you can be a better player and a better dungeon master for the now version, right? But you can use the now version to hit these resonances of earlier games. So like I said, a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game that is using Dark Sun is a good example of a dragon resonant game, right? So we have these two resonances for Dungeons & Dragons, and I think we need to use these resonances because Canon is so much less useful from an ontological perspective, talking about the thing itself. Canon has lost a lot of meaning, right? I don't think it's lost much value. I think it's really valuable that, whatever really far-ranging, very unusual slice you have for your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game, it's still canon under the First World Shard canon version, canon that's been established by James Wyatt, right? But now we can say, okay, well, if you're running a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game that has Faerun, which is specifically talked about within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that has classes that are already established within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that has races and classes that are established there, but that's a dungeon resonant. And if you're using Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to deal with elements that have never been introduced within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, like Dark Sun, then you are at a dragon resonance on that game. All that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think about adding resonance to our discussions of Dungeons & Dragons so that we can understand if a game is resonant with the current version or if it's resonant with previous versions? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.